What if the moment that you've been dreading, that moment in a doctor's office when they deliver bad news, is actually the beginning of something liberating? In this episode, I sat down with Dr. Raphaela. She's a paediatrician and a neurodevelopmental expert and the founder of the Full Spectrum app. And we had what turned out to be one of the most honest and tender conversations that I've had on this podcast. We talked about what it really means to raise a child whose brain works differently. And what she said stopped me in my tracks. We talk about the difference between grief and guilt. Every parent of a neurodivergent child has asked, did I cause this? And Raphaela explains why untangling those emotions of guilt and grief is one of the most important things you can do. We also talked a bit about neuroplasticity and what it means for the developing brain. Your baby's brain is an open window right now, and you need to jump right in. And we talk about why what you do at home every single day really matters. And then we had a very interesting conversation that Raphaela calls the space between the notes. She talked about the notes being therapy and the space being what you do at home, and it is fascinating. The one thing that she wishes for every parent of a neurodivergent child, well, that was the question I asked her at the end, and her answer is something that I think every single parent needs to hear. The journey is different, it isn't less, and we will unpack that. So if you are on the road with a neurodivergent child, or someone you love is, this conversation is for you. Do not miss it. Welcome to Sense by Meg Faure, where we make sense of the science and art of parenting. Parenting is grey, gritty, and beautiful all at once. And my life's work as a healthcare professional is helping parents feel more confident in a season that can feel really overwhelming. In each episode, we share honest conversations with real mums, dive into the science with experts, and simply make sense of it all in practical ways. This is your space. You're not alone, you're held. So let's unpack the journey of a lifetime with sense. Right, welcome back, mums and dads, to Sense by Meg Faure, the podcast where we bring you honest and evidence-based wisdom for real, beautiful, but messy business of raising children. I'm so glad that you're here today because we have got such an exciting conversation that's going to be happening today. It's something that's not always spoken about, and it's specifically for those of us who are dealing with neurodiversity as part of our parenting journey. And that is not as rare as you think. Many of us have some questions around our child's development and maybe on the journey towards getting a diagnosis, or may already have got a diagnosis. So whether it is you or a friend of yours or somebody in your community that is on this journey, this conversation is going to be absolutely amazing. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Raphaela Geva, and she's a pediatrician based in Cape Town, and she focuses very deeply on neurodivergence and neurodevelopment. So she has been involved with autistic diagnoses, ADD, cerebral palsy, and the full spectrum of how little one's brains develop and also diverge. She worked clinically at Red Cross Children's Hospital, where she specialized, and she runs her own private practice. In addition to that, she's actually developed an app for parents with little ones who are on the journey. It's called the Full Spectrum, and I'm sure we'll touch on that. And she really is a voice in the wilderness for many moms in the space of neurodivergence. So thank you so much for joining us, Raphaela.
Thank you for having me, Meg.
Right. So I was very interested when you and I chatted just a little bit about your journey. You had studied at Wits University, you then moved down to Red Cross Children's Hospital, and when you'd finished your ped speciality, you were quite ready to leave pediatrics altogether, and then got pulled back in and have become very curious and fascinated around this space of child development. So can you give us a little bit of a story about your journey and why you are so passionate?
So during my time specializing at Red Cross Children's Hospital, which was an absolute privilege, and really I was very grateful to have been able to specialize there, but it was also quite a grueling journey. And I have 3 of my own children, one of which I was pregnant with at the time. As well, I was quite tired and a little burnt out at the end of my journey. And I think, as I said to you, the last clinic as you leave Red Cross Children's Hospital in the outpatient department is the neurodevelopmental department. And it's a wonderful department with the most incredible head of neurodevelopment, Professor Kirsty Donald. And just on my way out the door, I happened to have a very inspiring conversation with her. And I never put that last foot out the door and ended up working with Professor Kirsty Donald and the team at Red Cross Children's Hospital for the last 6 or 7 years in a couple of capacities. We worked on a very big research project looking at the causes of neurodevelopmental disorders, and with the Broad Institute in MIT of hundreds of children across Africa. I worked in the clinical department there in the neurodevelopmental clinic and cerebral palsy clinic, as well as the high-risk clinic that was mainly diagnostics and management of neurodivergent children. I taught at UCT a little, and I have worked at 3 of the LSIN schools within the Cape Metropole. And so that was, I think, a really nice 360-degree view of the process and the journey that children go on, right from pre-diagnosis to diagnosis to intervention, and then outside of an acute hospital setting in the big wide world, or within an education setting, what support children and parents actually need.
And you do have a private practice as well, in addition to that.
Yes, I've wound down a lot of my work in the government sector. I no longer teach at UCT, and I am only affiliated with Red Cross Children's Hospital. I don't do any clinical work there at the moment, and I'm focusing mainly on my private practice in Cape Town.
That's amazing. So I want to go back to something you said. You said you were pregnant when you were working at Red Cross. And has there ever been, with everything that you're seeing in your practice, has it increased your fear of neurodivergence, particularly when you were pregnant? I mean, did you have anxiety around that? How personal, or what sort of lens did your personal journey lend to where you've ended up?
So it's such an interesting question, and I have always answered this both ways. I think being a parent certainly makes you a better doctor and a worse one. It makes you a better doctor because you're able to really first person empathize. You have lived experience of all the anxiety and fear of, growing a little person and being a mom. And so you can really, really understand your patient's perspective. And it makes you a worse doctor because sometimes it really tugs at your heartstrings. And it's difficult to divorce the very personal and empathetic person from, that very hyper rational clinical mind. So I think it swings both ways. I think your journey as a parent is full of fear and unknown across a whole range of possibilities, not only neurodivergence. We're scared of giving birth to a baby at the right time and being a good parent to that baby, and we're afraid of infectious and communicable diseases. We're afraid of crime and bullies and school, and what kind of a mum am I going to be? And so I think the parenting journey is fraught with uncertainty and fraught with fear. My particular personal journey wasn't necessarily, I had my children in and around the COVID areas, so I think my personal fears were more around, firstly, not being present and available while I was specializing. And secondly, making mistakes like all mums and parents are scared of. And thirdly, around infectious diseases, given the climate that I was bringing my children up in the early, good couple of years ago, 2020, 2021. So I never had a real personal fear of neurodivergence.
So let's talk about neurodivergence, because neurodiversity is like the phrase that gets bandied around everywhere now. I mean, I think almost everybody sees themselves somewhere on the spectrum, which of course is in fact true because it's a spectrum. But neurodiversity is terrifying, and lots of parents don't really understand what it is. So when a family comes to you for the first time, and maybe they've got a baby who is typically developing or not typically developing, and they sit in front of you and you need to use the word neurodivergence or start to talk about it, how do you frame neurodivergence? What actually is it?
So it's a good question, because I think we use neurodiversity and neurodivergence incorrectly and interchangeably a lot of the time. Let's start with neurodiversity. And neurodiversity really just means that we are all developing and respond to our environment in various ways. We are all diverse, the same way that we all look different, have different color hair, different color eyes. We are also all different in the way that we respond to our sensory world around us. And that is an umbrella term which explains neurodiversity. We are all, populations are diverse. Neurodivergence is kind of where we draw the line between what we call neurotypical responses or neurotypical development and typical children may have aspects of sensory sensitivities or language delays, but it isn't really causing an element of dysfunction or of challenge. And I think that's where we begin to separate between neurodivergence and neurotypical. Neurodivergence would then mean we are processing our world around us with specific challenges, so to speak. And those challenges may be in socio-emotional reciprocity, they may be in the realm of anxiety, it may be with a dyslexia or a dyspraxia. And so there is, how do I say, a difference in the way our children, neurodivergent children, are responding and learning in the world, which may have an element of challenge associated with it.
And it's almost that mismatch between sometimes what the environment is demanding and what we need in order to function in our world, and what our neural capacities are to actually meet that need. Would you say?
Absolutely. Our role certainly isn't to pathologize a different processing, a different way of processing. It's certainly just a framework of understanding so that we can learn how to interpret those behaviors or those signals and support a child in those ways. Very often it's a mismatch between expectation or demand and what a child is capable of in that moment in time. And so this certainly isn't about fixing an incorrect pathway or an incorrect child. It's about understanding their processes so that we can support that little one better to function in a world which is demanding.
So I'm sure that you've had many of a situation where you've had parents sitting in front of you and they've got some flags, red flags that they've brought to you, or maybe they haven't brought the red flags and red flags are screaming all over your head as you're looking at this little one. What does it feel like in that moment for parents when they're either coming to you because they're worried, or you've got to say to them, actually, I'm worried and I think we need to do some more investigations? What does that moment feel like for parents?
I think it's a really difficult moment. There's so much at play when parents walk into the room to explore neurodivergence or neurodiversity. I think there is both fear and grief. And I think those are two nuances to hold at the same time, because you're brave enough to step into the doctor's office and you're exploring something which may be difficult for you, but that doesn't mean it's not a difficult thing to hold and to tolerate. I think that moment can again swing both ways. I think it comes with a moment of panic and fear because there is an acknowledgement that something that you've deeply suspected for a long time is affirmed. But then once we work through that, I think that framework can actually be very liberating and containing for parents, because now you can begin to replace those question marks with real, with real neuroscientific facts and years of scientific research on understanding, and you can begin a process of understanding and decoding and support. And I think, yes, it's that tension between that shock and that grief, and then that relief and understanding.
And I'm sure for every parent, it's quite different, because you'll probably get the parents who it catalyzes action, and then you'll get other parents who, there's catatonic fear, and where you can't do anything because you're deer in the headlights. I mean, do you see both of those responses?
Absolutely. And sometimes I see that when a mum is sprung into action and a dad is a deer in the headlights, or the opposite way around. So certainly, that's very common, and it's my job to kind of hold both of those realities, or all of these realities, in the room at the same time, and go at what we call the pace of the child. So as sensitive and as patient as we are within the whole family context, I think in my practice, all of that is completely relevant and completely important, but we do try to prioritize the needs of the child.
Of course, there are the needs of the mum as well. And I think about one of the things that I've certainly experienced, through looking through lenses of friends of mine who've had diagnoses for their little ones, where there's that big question of, did I cause this? Could I have done something different in pregnancy that this wouldn't happen like this? Can you talk a little bit about this guilt that is wrapped up in this diagnostic process?
I think guilt is such a big thing that it's so often a barrier to seeking care because we feel we will be blamed for not breastfeeding or having a cesarean section or going back to work at 3 months. And the biggest distinction that I can think of to make is that we have to separate guilt from grief. So guilt says, did I cause this? And grief says, this isn't what I expected and this is difficult. And we can totally hold and allow grief. But what we try to do is untangle that guilt because neurodivergence is so multifactorial. It is a combination of environmental factors, genetic factors, express genes, epigenetics, behavioral responses, generational trauma, and also de novo changes in societal demands. And so it is almost never one person's fault for one specific thing. And so I often try to, explain that there's guilt and grief, and the grief is we can hold the grief and work through the grief as much as possible, but certainly try to explain to the parents that or almost never is it anybody's fault.
I think as parents, we're just always looking to ourselves. We feel like we should have done something differently, and it must be even more so at this point. But of course, retrospective views and looking back and trying to change the past is not possible. But changing the future is something that's very real for these children. And I'm very, very interested in and obsessed by early intervention. I mean, is the only reason I do what I do, because I know that if you can impact this early developing brain, you get this incredible opportunity. So could you talk to us a little bit about neuroplasticity, which is probably a term that a lot of parents don't know, and what that is, and how much early intervention can have an impact on the journey for these little ones?
Absolutely. So the adage which we are always taught is early intervention creates the best outcomes. So early diagnosis, early intervention has the best outcomes. And really that is true. If you focusing on neuroplasticity, really that the simple way of understanding that is just how quickly new neural pathways are formed in a child's brain compared to an adult's brain. Even if you just think about the size of a child's brain, it's much smaller and it has so much, it needs to grow. But by the child is 5 years old, the size of a 5-year-old's brain is quite similar to the size of an adult brain. And so a lot of those pathways are already set. We know the importance of the first 1,000 days and certainly within the first 5 years of life. But it's really the ease with which those neurons fire and create new learning pathways. And that's what we call neuroplasticity. It's how a child's neurons respond to motor skills, adaptive function, developmental outcomes, early communication. If you think about how easy it is for a child to learn a new language or a musical instrument compared to an adult, that's a really kind of real world example of how more adaptive a child's brain is. And then we know that we can do much better the earlier we intervene because those pathways are so plastic. And I think the adage on early intervention is not so much that we're changing the child to fit into the world, but we're changing the experience of this child to understand and explore their world with confidence and with understanding. And so that early support really changes the whole climate of this child's experience. And so we try and wire for more positive feedbacks and more secure learning. And we do that by, supporting a family and a child so that the whole environment is geared towards understanding and learning rather than fear, mislabel, misunderstanding. And in those moments, we miss those opportunities for neural connection and new neural pathways.
So while you were talking, I was thinking in my mind of 3 buckets of intervention that can really be rolled out. So the first one would be medical and kind of allopathic and any of the medical interventions, things like an anti-epilepsy drug, something where a doctor can do a prescription and it's a simple thing, or maybe it's some surgery, or whatever it is that can change the trajectory from a medical and a physiological perspective. Then I think about the bucket of therapy, which is obviously where I sit, the OTs, the physios, the speech therapists, and that early intervention strategy. And then I think about the relationship of the parent and the child, because I've always had this incredible belief that the parents hold such an incredible role in their children's lives in terms of relationship. And that's actually a huge amount of what we do, is that the biggest intervention happens when it happens in the home because it's 24/7, and the therapeutic interventions, the therapists, that kind of happens once or twice a week. And so it's you will have more impact if you intervene at home. So do you work with parents on their relationship, and what sort of advice would you be giving to a mom who's come in, she's got a little one who's not developing typically now at this point, there needs to be some adjustments to their environment or to their relationship? Where do you start with the mom? Today's Dose of Sense is brought to you by Parent Sense, the expert-based parenting app that gives you daily support from pregnancy to sleep, feeding, and daily routines. Take the guesswork out of parenting. Download Parent Sense today and use the code SENSE50 for 50% off. Where do you start with the mum?
So I think you've summarized it so beautifully, Meg. And we, certainly in my practice, we always look at a biopsychosocial approach. Obviously, as you've so eloquently put, we need to make sure that there aren't biological factors that we can modify, because obviously those are important. Psychological factors, as you say, or therapeutic intervention, which is so important. And I don't want to miss the opportunity to stress the importance of a multidisciplinary team. Occupational therapists, speech therapists, educational psychologists, pediatricians, and even sometimes child psychiatrists and child psychologists all have such a very unique lens that they use to view a child. And for me, it's not so much just identifying those weaknesses, but really understanding the strengths of this child and who this person is and how they respond, and joining those dots across all of those domains in order to get a holistic understanding of this child. And I think that fits beautifully into the third realm that you've described, and I agree with you fully. I always refer to what happens at home as the space between the notes, because parents, I think, put a huge amount of expectation on the speech therapy appointment or on the doctor's appointment. And there's huge hopes that in those 30 or 45 minutes or an hour, the world is going to change. But as you've said, it isn't in those big bang moments that the world changes. That slow, secure repetition of what happens at home. In my practice, we start the process and we have a diagnostic process, and a parent will always walk out of my room with three things: a neurodevelopmental report, a document called Understanding Your Child, which unpacks the behaviors, because obviously we see just the tip of the iceberg, and behavior in children is communication, and we need to decode that communication and that behavior to understand what's driving those if we hope to intervene in a meaningful way. So an Understanding Your Child document, which explains, why a child with PDA may be a little bit resistant to authority, or why a child with ADHD may struggle to sit still. And so I really spend a lot of time unpacking those behaviors, because I think understanding is the key that unlocks a lot of frustration. And the third document is a Rationalised Action Map. And that is a prioritized stepwise document which says, this is your first priority. And your first priority is just to get out of the house in the mornings without tumbleweeding into your day after 3 hours of tantrums and, smashing headfirst into your day at work because you're totally dysregulated after a chaotic morning. And if that is the family's priority, then that's where we start. We have to recognize that there are also financial limitations, cultural limitations, family dynamics, and we need to come up with a prioritized action map which fits into all of these things within a family. And so I really believe that by including parents in this process and empowering them to make small, understandable, educated changes within the home, that's where the magic happens. That's where the gold is that unlocks, life from just kind of merely surviving to a joyful, happy, enjoyable experience with your children.
Well, I can tell you right now that every mother of a neurodivergent child is sitting listening to you and going, oh my gosh, do I need these three documents? And the middle document that you spoke about, which is fascinating, the tip of the iceberg, understanding the behaviors and what's going on underneath them. I mean, that really speaks to me. In psychology, we talk about reflective function, which is the ability to understand what lies behind the behavior and to understand the emotion behind it, or the sentiment, or whatever it is. And when we are reflective parents, we are just so much more powerful. In the Parent Sense app, we have a course called the Sensory Personality course, and this is for neurotypical and neurodivergent children. Is understanding your baby or your child's or even your spouse's sensory personality can actually change the way you engage with them. And so just understanding why people are like they are just puts so much more empathy into your responses to them, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Really, I think this is I wrote an article once which said if there was one intervention that I could make, I would say it is take the time to understand what's beneath the behavior, what's beneath your child's behavior, what's beneath your responses, what's beneath the triggers that you kind of get into an argument with your husband. Understanding what's underneath that is so disarming. And it really is the beginning of all of empathy. And I think when you work from a framework of empathy and understanding, the whole system is much less charged and the whole ecosystem is much healthier and much more regulated.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned just now the biopsychosocial model, which anybody who has studied anything in the kind of behavioral sciences space will know all about. The third word in that biopsychosocial is obviously social. And these diagnoses and these conditions do not happen in a vacuum. And so not only do we have parents impacted significantly by a diagnosis, but we also have siblings and extended family. And in actual fact, in some ways, I think a lot of the pain that mothers bear and fathers bear comes from the way that society responds to them, how included they are, how empathetic people are. If I'm listening to this and I am, well, first of all, as a mom, trying to think about including and dealing with other siblings, but also as an auntie or as a friend who's dealing with a friend who's just had a child with a diagnosis, how can we use our environment, our social environment, to really nurture these little ones and to make the paths a little easier for ourselves or our friends who are going through it as well?
I think given the incidence of neurodivergence or how prevalent neurodiverse traits are or neurodivergent traits are in our everyday, in our schools, in our restaurants, on the bus, in our workplace, it's almost impossible to ignore, to ignore this reality. Teachers are finding a very different classroom today to how they to classrooms a couple of years ago. And so it's almost essential that we are sensitive to these kind of nuances just in our everyday goings on. I think how can we really switch on the sensitivity is just, again, by being educated and aware. There's a little meme that says, you don't shout at somebody else because you never know what they've got, what they're dealing with on that day. It's a bit of a fluffy answer, Meg, but the truth is, I think we have to be aware that traits exist in all humans all around us, and it's just a matter of degree. So I think just to be sensitive to things like background noise or how loud we speak or how close we come to somebody, how judgmental we are, how tolerant we are of a child who maybe takes a couple more minutes to warm up or doesn't greet you or shake your hand, that may have been perceived as, bad manners or rudeness a couple of years ago. But now with a framework of understanding neurodivergence, I think we need to be a lot more tolerant and a lot more accepting of that kind of realm of normal. And just to take a step back and realize that neurodivergence is all around us, even in our own day-to-day going on. And some people can't wake up without coffee in the morning. Some people need 3 cups of green tea. These are all just sensitivities, which are splendid and make us diverse and different, but we do need to be aware of them in the workplace, in the school, on the bus, within families. I think it really just comes down to education and awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. So right at the beginning, you spoke about the fact that you were involved in a study about the etiology or the causal factors around neurodivergence. I'd love for you to give us a couple of things that what were the findings? A lot of parents often people say to me all the time, why is there such an increase in neurodivergence now? Is it because people are just getting very good at labeling conditions that in the past would have just been called naughtiness or difficult or whatever? So is it in how many in the labels, or is there a true and real increase in neurodivergence now? And if there is, what would that be due to?
It's a very interesting question, and the answer is twofold. Certainly, we do have much more awareness. If you think about how we used to treat mental illness back in the day, or autism, or any kind of neurodivergence, we were quite intolerant, and we thought that those behaviors were very pathologized and very aberrant. And we had no framework of understanding difference. So certainly in terms of education and understanding, we understand that the spectrum of normal or the spectrum of behavior is much wider and much more diverse than we thought. We also have much better ways to understand it because of neuroscientific research. So certainly our awareness and our diagnostic capabilities have improved, and that is certainly contributing to the increased incidence and prevalence of neurodiversity in our communities, or neurodivergence in our communities. The true incidence is also increasing, and that the cause of that is multifactorial. We know that there are genetic predispositions to neurodivergence, certainly autisms, dyslexias, ADHDs, those run in families. We don't have a clear heritable pattern. It's not like if you have blue eyes, that's a recessive trait, and we know how that's passed. It's not clear exactly how those traits are passed down for, just autism or just dyslexia. It is usually multifactorial. In the study that I was working on, the findings were very interesting because they found clusters of syndromes or clusters of behavior for which we could identify what we call de novo or new areas on the genome, which we didn't know were associated with those behaviors before. But for the general population, I don't think, certainly yet, and that data is still being analyzed and published. But it's not that we found one answer for how neurodivergence is transmitted genetically or passed down through generations. It is a combination of environment, gene expression, epigenetics, and really just the changing demands and sensory demands of children and of people in our modern day society. If you think about a couple of years ago, without technology and emails and the rate of communication, we weren't required to multitask and do as many things then as we are now. And I certainly think that humans, although we are adapting very well, it's also causing a couple of social overwhelm or some sociological evolutionary misfires because the demands on people today are huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that obviously comes to mind there is technology. And a few months ago, I read an absolutely fascinating post on LinkedIn, which went wildly viral. It was probably one of the most viral posts I'd ever seen, which was a psychotherapist based in Canada, Nicole Runyon, and we actually did an episode together where she said, are we over pathologizing our children, or is there a mismatch between environmental demands and what the human developing brain needs? And of course, she was alluding to technology, that the environmental demand or the environmental conditions provided by technology, watching screens and being on screens all the time, is a real toxin, as it were, for the developing brain. So do you think that some of what we're seeing or some of what you see in your practice does have some base, or at least is being impacted on by the use of technology by children under 3?
Absolutely. It's not only the negative effects of what technology is doing, but it's what children are not doing when they are engaging with technology. They aren't connecting, they aren't playing, they aren't using their bodies, they aren't engaging in, socially reciprocal tasks. We aren't talking, we aren't problem solving. And so it really is a double-edged sword.
Are you worried?
I am worried. But I also see very invested, aware parents who are really trying to turn the tide. We have these no phone school policies now. I think parents are trying to limit social interaction, and I think it was a bit hugely unregulated space with an explosion of technological advancement, and now we're starting to realize, hold on, we need to rein this in a little bit. So I am worried, but I'm also hopeful because I think parents are becoming much more responsive and much more alive to the risks.
Such an interesting conversation. So I think as we finish off, I wanted to ask you if you had to say one thing to every parent of a neurodivergent child or toddler, something that you wish that every parent needs to hear when they're on this journey, what would it be?
I would say that the journey is different. It's not less. And I think if you zoom in on any parent-child journey, that journey, neurodivergent or neurotypical, is fraught with highs and lows, challenges and celebrations. I think just by virtue of the fact that you're in the room and we're observing your child under a lens, looking for specific traits, may make you feel like your journey is particularly hard. And I'm certainly not taking away from it, because there are certainly harder things and less hard things within the parenting journey. But I definitely want to assure you that no parenting journey is smooth and constant. It is full of ups and downs. And really, by jumping onto this train, you're not labeling your child or incarcerating your child in a diagnosis. You really are at the beginning of understanding. And the intention is to liberate your child from the confines of misunderstanding into a place of support and understanding, so that they can be the best version of themselves that they can be.
Oh, I love that. It really makes me feel quite emotional. One of my very close friends has a child who's on a different journey, and that actually has been her experience. I mean, they are just the most wonderful parents to her, and their journey, as different as it is, has got so many joys in it as well. Very different, but absolutely wonderful experiences. And I think every parent needs to hear that. So thank you. This is exactly the conversation that I think every parent of a differently wired child needs to hear. Not because we have all the answers, and I know you don't, even though you have a lot more answers than the rest of us do, but because a conversation like this gives us permission to grieve, to understand the difference of the journey, to not have it all figured out, and also to know that just by showing up and being connected and curious about your child is really enough in this journey. So thank you very much for sharing everything that you've shared today, Raphaela.
Thank you for your insightful questions, Meg. I agree with you. This is one of the most important conversations. And wouldn't it be nice if we all came home from the hospital with an understanding your child piece of paper in our hands? So certainly it's an invitation for all parents to explore who their children are, rather than only seeking out pathology, because it's really important to understand all the complexities of parenthood and childhood. And I hope that there are good people around there to support you on this journey, and you definitely don't have to do it alone.
Amazing. Well, I know that a lot of parents will be thinking that there is a good person to support them, and it's you. So how would they get hold of you if they wanted to actually come to your practice, or are you on social media? Can you give us where people can get hold of you?
So my surname is basically unpronounceable, Itzikowitz. So I use drraphaela.com as my website. That's far few Z's and T's to make a mistake on. We're also on Instagram as Dr. Raphaela Itzikowitz. Sorry, I did need to put my name in there somewhere. You can follow me on Instagram with that URL. You can WhatsApp us, you can book online. So if you go to drraphaela.com, all the information, all our services are there, and there is a link to a WhatsApp or to an online booking link.
Amazing. Well, there you go, mums and dads. You would definitely be able to get hold of Dr. Raphaela if you needed to. And yeah, if you are on this journey, we're holding you. We are here. And certainly a conversation that I want to continue with Dr. Raphaela, because I think that this is something we need to include inside our app and in our communities as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for joining me today. I hope today's conversation brought you a little more clarity, calm, and confidence on your parenting journey. If you enjoyed the episode, please do share it with a friend who needs to hear it today. And also go and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss out on an episode. I'll be back next week with another episode, same time, same place, and always here to support you. And in the meantime, download the Parent Sense app to take the guesswork out of feeding, sleep, weaning, routines, and everything in between.